Okay, the brave lady that did the commercial for us and was brave enough to use her name, she's there in the back. I'd like Pam Smith to stand up. Like I say, Pam is well known throughout the community, and for her to use her name on our radio ad speaks a lot to her. I'm proud to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Richard Mourdock. Richard serves as Indiana's Chief Investment Officer, where he seeks to maximize the return on the state's investment portfolio. He serves on a total of 13 boards and commissions in his official position. Richard serves as Vice Chairman of the College Savings Plans Network and Midwest Region Vice President of the National Association of State Treasurers. Recently, Richard was at the center of the national debate on the automobile industry bailout as he pursued a case on behalf of Indiana pensioners all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. As a result of the Chrysler case, Richard has frequently been cited for his willingness to stand up for the rule of law, the U.S. Constitution, and individual property rights. Richard holds a master's degree in geology from Ball State University and a bachelor's degree from Defiance College in Ohio. Now I want to say something. Richard got up and drove from Indianapolis to St. Joe County, which is where the state line between Michigan and Indiana is. He gave a speech at 8:30 this morning up there. He drove down here to give a speech here in Madison, and from here he drives to Evansville to give a speech in Evansville. Now we're figuring that that's probably 10 to 11 hours of driving and 500 miles. Now if that isn't passion for what you're doing, I don't know what is. I've heard Richard speak on YouTube. I'm really excited that he's come here, and I really look forward to what he's got to say. So I give you State Treasurer Richard Mourdock.
Thank you very much. And I never would have thought I would come to Madison, Indiana to say this, but it's colder in Madison than it was in South Bend this morning. I put the sweater on when I got out of the truck here, not up there. But it has been a long day. But you know what? There are only 31 days left. 31 days. And, you know, it is such a fascinating, fascinating election season. The first time I ever had my name on a ballot was 1988. And I will tell you, I've gone through a lot of ups and downs through those political cycles. I remember 1994 and all the excitement that had when supposedly the Republican Revolution was going to change Washington, and unfortunately a lot of the people we sent changed into Washington. But all that I saw then, all that I've seen since then, does not come close to the enthusiasm, the energy that I sense this year in 2010.
Very good.
As I've been traveling the state, I've been wanting to stop into a bunch of the local radio stations and tell them, you know guys, you need to be running some public service announcements. And the public service announcement needs to simply say this: in the interest of your health, do not allow yourself to be standing at the end of a Tea Party member's driveway at 5:50 a.m. on November 2nd. You will be run over. There will be a message sent on November 2nd, and the first message I know is going to be sent in the sound of squealing tires as people are going to the polls to make their decision and cast their vote. Well, you know, I've got a very simple message for you today, and as mentioned in the kind resume there, the kind introduction, I do get to speak about Abraham Lincoln a great deal and that middle 19th century history, and I want to kind of set my tone, if I may, by asking you to imagine a room in 1838, about the size of this room, and it was filled with people. It happened to be in about this time of year, actually, in October. And it was something called the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois. Now, if you've never heard of a lyceum, back then when there were obviously no 24-hour news channels, there weren't even a lot of newspapers around, there weren't public libraries, there weren't a lot of occasions for people to get together. And there was a movement across the entire country called the Lyceum Movement where citizens just came together to hear some speaker or to hear a little panel discussion on some topic. And on that night in October 1838, a 28-year-old man came to the podium to speak. And it's the first time he gave a speech that was ever recorded. And that person was Abraham Lincoln. Now, we don't know if he chose his topic that night or if it was assigned to him. But at age 28, Abraham Lincoln was still kind of working on becoming a lawyer. He was actually an apprentice for a guy by the name of John Stuart. So he was very much into the law right at that point in his life. So he may well have chosen the topic. And the topic that he addressed the Lyceum with was simply this: how do we keep alive the spirit of the American Revolution? Now, if you think about it, that may seem kind of an odd topic, but think of the time for a moment. It was 60 years since the American Revolution. And those young men who had fought even as teenagers in the American Revolution, just during those last few years of the 1820s and 1830s, the last of them were dying off before that generation's eyes, and they realized there was something really dramatic changing here. The people who founded the country were leaving. And how could we keep that spirit alive? Abraham Lincoln, at the age of 28, as I say, the first speech that was ever recorded that he gave, it's kind of interesting. You know, Abraham Lincoln ultimately became known as this master of the English language. In just 272 words at Gettysburg, he kind of laid out who we were, who we went, and what we shall forever, with God's blessing, be. 272 words. But as a young man, Abraham Lincoln used some pretty lofty, some pretty grandiose language. There's one quote that you may have heard before out of that speech, where he talked about the greatness of America and how powerful we were, and he said, and this isn't an exact quote, but it's pretty close. He said, no transatlantic giant, no transatlantic military could come across the ocean and even set a step or a track on the Blue Ridge or ever take a drink from the Ohio, not in the course, not in the trail of 1,000 years. Pretty lofty language, right? But the main theme that Abraham Lincoln used that day in addressing that question, how do we keep the spirit of the American Revolution alive? He said, here's what we have to do. We have to make the law matter. We cannot just turn our back on the law. And you may think, well, that might be a strange thing to say. Why would Lincoln have used that as a topic? Why would he suggest that the law was being avoided or ignored? And that's the key to the speech. Because Lincoln used the examples that day of how in the southern United States at that point, men who were going into communities and setting up little gambling houses were being grabbed and lynched. He spoke that day of a freed black man who had been living in St. Louis. Missouri was a slave state, don't forget. But it was a freed black man who was walking down the street. He was grabbed, tied to a tree, and as horrific as it sounds, was set ablaze. And then Lincoln made reference to something that had happened just in Illinois, not too many months before. You see, there was a printer, a publisher by the name of Elijah Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist. He wanted to do away with slavery. He had originally been in St. Louis, again, a slave state, and he was so unpopular, he'd received so many threats, that he packed up his business and moved across the river to Alton, Illinois. He'd been there just a few months. He started publishing again. And one night, a bunch of renegade-type folks broke into his house, grabbed his printing press, broke it apart, supposedly threw it in the Mississippi River. There was a gunfight, and Elijah Lovejoy was killed. Some historians will tell you